Hello everybody, this is lesson 14 of the lecture International Economics. I will discuss slide 35 to 51 of chapter 2, Economic Growth in Open Economies. In this lesson we will open the Solow-Swan model and analyze how free international trade influences the growth process and the position of the steady state. In an open economy, the adjustment process in transition to the steady state changes. Domestic savers have then the possibility to invest their money in the country with the largest interest rate. Conversely, domestic investors have the possibility to finance their investments with credits from the country with the lowest interest rate. Consequently, domestic investment has no longer necessarily to equal domestic savings. To understand the consequences of this difference, let's start the analysis from the perspective of the capital market. This is a standard capital market where we have the average interest rate on the y-axis and the investment and savings volume on the x-axis. Since under the assumptions of the Solow-Swan model, savings depend on the savings ratio times the level of GDP, but not on the interest rate, the savings supply curve is a vertical curve here, like this one. So it shifts only if GDP changes or if the savings ratio will change. But it does not depend on the interest rate, therefore it has no slope. Investment, however, depends on the interest rate and has a negative slope. Since lower interest rates imply lower investment costs, investment credit demand typically grows when interest rates are lower. In case of a closed economy, the domestic interest rate adjusts in such a way that domestic investment demand is always just as large as domestic savings, which is certainly the case at this autarky equilibrium interest rate level. Even if the world market interest rate would be much higher than the autarky interest rate, domestic savers were not able to invest their money in foreign countries because it's simply legally forbidden in a closed economy, state of autarky. Let's now assume that the law has changed and it is allowed to invest or borrow in foreign countries, such that we have the case of an open economy. In this case, domestic savers can profit from higher world market interest rates. So, domestic investors must pay the higher world market interest rate too. They can no longer rely on the lower autarky interest rate level, since it is simply not available. Since the world market interest rate is higher than the autarky interest rate, domestic investment falls to a lower level. The excess between domestic savings and domestic investment, this line segment here, flows to foreign countries as capital export. As a result, domestic investment falls compared to the situation in a closed economy. where we have this amount of domestic investment, and in an open economy we have only this amount of domestic investment. If, however, the world market interest rate lies below the autarky interest rate, the opposite happens. In this case, domestic investors can profit from the lower world market interest rate. So, domestic savers must accept the lower world market interest rate. They can no longer rely on the higher autarky interest rate. Since the world market interest rate is lower than the autarky interest rate, domestic investment grows to a higher level. The difference between domestic investment and domestic savings flow as capital imports from foreign countries to the domestic economy. As a result, domestic investment grows compared to a closed economy. So now domestic investment is clearly larger than in a closed economy, where it equals this amount only. This means if the world market interest rate is lower than the domestic market interest rate in case of autarky, the inland borrows from foreign countries and purchases with these credits goods in foreign countries, which are then invested in the domestic capital stock. So the domestic capital stock does then grow faster as in the case of autarky, and its steady state level is higher. From the balance of payment, which we have discussed at the beginning of this chapter, we know that capital imports imply that savings are smaller than domestic investment, such that we have a negative balance in the capital balance, and we know that this must equal the negative balance in the current account. So in this case, exports must be smaller than imports. Now let's transfer this scenario to the Solow-Swan model. If domestic investment is higher than domestic saving, we have to introduce now an investment curve which lies above the domestic savings curve. So we need a further curve, an additional curve that represents the investment volume in this economy. This curve equals domestic savings plus the capital imports from other countries. So the difference between the savings curve and the investment curve tells us the volume of capital imports at a given capital stock. If the economy opens now for free trade and capital movements, given the old capital stock K star 1, gross investment is now larger than capital depreciation, such that positive net investment results and the capital stock starts growing again. This process holds on until gross investment equals capital depreciation. So this is now the new steady state capital stock and the new steady state level of GDP. Due to capital imports, the steady state capital stock is now higher than under autarky. Thus, the steady state GDP is higher because of capital imports. However, interest to foreigners has to be paid for the credits received from foreigners in terms of capital imports. As a result, a part of the income generated domestically flows as interest payments abroad every year. Gross national product, GNP, the part of income which flows to domestic residents, is smaller than GDP in case of capital imports. A mathematical solution of the impact of capital imports on domestic income shows that the net effect is typically positive. Not only interest payments are sent abroad, but the immobile production factors, especially labor, also receive higher remuneration because of the higher steady state capital stock, which increases their productivity. Since in case of net capital imports, interest have to be paid from domestic GDP to foreign savers, domestic GDP is now larger than GNP, gross national product, the money that is the source for domestic incomes. So we have to reduce somewhat GDP, which we are able to produce given this higher capital stock, for the interest payments which flow to the creditors in foreign countries, such that gross national product is somewhat smaller than gross domestic product. Now let's turn to the obverse case. If the world market interest rate is higher than the domestic market interest rate in case of autarky, foreign countries borrow now from the inland and purchase with these credits goods from the inland, which are then invested in foreign capital stocks. The domestic capital stock does then grow slower as in the case of autarky, and its steady state level will also be lower. From the capital payment, from the balance of capital payments which we have derived in the last lesson, we know that in this case savings are larger than investments, such that exports must be also larger than imports of goods and services. So we have now a current account surplus. Again, let's start the analysis from the perspective of the capital market. In this case, where the world market interest rate is higher than the domestic autarky interest rate, savers can profit from the higher world market interest rate if they invest their money in foreign countries instead of the domestic economy. So domestic savers can profit from the higher world market interest rate. Domestic investors must then accept the higher world market interest rate too. They can no longer rely on the lower autarky interest rate. Since the world market interest rate is now higher than the autarky interest rate, domestic investment falls to a lower level. From this level under autarky to this level in an open economy. The excess difference between domestic savings and investment flow as capital exports to foreign countries. As a result, domestic investment falls compared to the situation in a closed economy. Instead of this investment volume, we now, in an open economy, have only this investment volume. Let's now again transfer this scenario to the Solow-Swan model. If domestic investment is lower than domestic savings, we have to introduce now an investment curve which lies below the domestic savings curve, like this one, for example. The difference between domestic savings and gross investment marks the size of capital exports. So the difference between the yellow line, which is the gross investment line, and the green line, which is the domestic savings line, indicates the volume of capital exports. If the economy opens now for free international trade and capital movements, given the old steady state capital stock K star 1, gross investment is smaller than capital depreciation, such that negative net investment results and the capital stock starts shrinking. This process holds on until gross investment equals again capital depreciation, such that net investment equals 0. This is now the new steady state. This is the new steady state capital stock K star 2, and this is the quantity of GDP which we can produce with this new capital stock Y star 2. Due to capital exports, the steady state capital stock, and hence the steady state level of GDP, is smaller than under autarky. Thus, steady state GDP is lower because of capital exports. However, interest to domestic savers has to be paid for credits received from them. As a result, a part of the income generated abroad flows now as interest payments to domestic savers every year. Hence, gross national product is now higher than GDP. Again, a mathematical calculation of the impact of capital imports on domestic incomes shows that the net effect is typically negative. Despite of the interest payments from abroad, the immobile domestic production factors, especially labor, also receive a lower remuneration because the smaller steady state capital stock decreases now their productivity. Since in case of net capital exports, interest is paid from foreign countries to domestic savers, gross domestic product is now smaller than gross national product. The money that is the source for domestic incomes. So the domestic economy profits a little bit from capital exports, but this does not change the level of GDP in a way that we come back to the level of GDP we had given the old steady state capital stock before we opened the economy. So capital exports, which go always hand in hand with the surplus in the current account balance, which means net exports of goods and services, the situation we typically have in Germany, lead to a lower steady state level of GDP. So much for this lesson. In the next lesson, we will draw some policy conclusions from the open economy version of the Solow-Swan model.